Welcome to Bible History. Today's video is about the Canaanites from the Bible. The Canaanites were a group of ancient people mentioned throughout the Bible, and their story is deeply woven into the history of Israel. They were not a single nation, but a collection of city-states and tribal groups that lived in the land of Canaan, which included modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan. The land was known for its fertility, strategic location, and cultural influence. The Bible refers to Canaan as the land that God promised to Abraham and his descendants, the Israelites. The origin of the Canaanites goes back to Genesis 10, often referred to as the Table of Nations. In verse 6 we read, "The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan." Then in verses 15-18, it says, "Canaan fathered Sidon his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites." From this passage, we learn that the Canaanites were descendants of Ham, the son of Noah, and that they were the ancestors of various tribes that would later inhabit the land of Canaan. One of the earliest mentions of Canaan in a promise comes in Genesis 12-5-7, when God tells Abraham, "To your offspring I will give this land." At that time, the land was already occupied by Canaanites. In Genesis 13:7, the text says, "At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land." This sets the stage for a long and complex relationship between the Israelites and the Canaanites. While the land was promised to Abraham and his descendants, the Canaanites continued to dwell there for generations, leading to eventual conflict. The Canaanite religion was one of the main reasons God commanded the Israelites to drive them out. They worshipped many gods, most notably Baal, Asherah, and Molech. Their religious practices were corrupt and included temple prostitution, child sacrifice, and divination. In Leviticus 18, God lists numerous abominations that the Canaanites practiced and commands the Israelites not to follow those ways. Leviticus 18:24-25 says, "Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants." God's command to Israel to destroy the Canaanite nations was not a matter of ethnic cleansing or conquest for personal gain. It was an act of divine judgment. In Deuteronomy 9:4-5, Moses tells Israel, "Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, 'It is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land,' whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you." The conquest of Canaan is detailed in the book of Joshua. After wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, the Israelites, under Joshua's leadership, crossed the Jordan River and began the process of conquering the Canaanite cities. The first major victory came at Jericho, where the walls miraculously fell after the Israelites marched around the city for 7 days. This story is told in Joshua 6. Then came the defeat of Ai in Joshua 8, and eventually a string of victories over Canaanite kings and cities. Despite God's clear command to drive out or destroy the Canaanites, the Israelites did not fully obey. Joshua 13:1-6 speaks of land that still remained unconquered. In Judges 1, we see that many of the tribes of Israel failed to drive out the inhabitants completely. Instead, they allowed them to remain in the land, either coexisting with them or forcing them into labor. Judges 1:28 says, "When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not drive them out completely." This disobedience had serious consequences. The Canaanite influence persisted, and Israel began to adopt their customs and worship their gods. Judges 2:11-13 says, And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them. This spiritual compromise led to God's judgment upon Israel, often in the form of oppression from surrounding nations. Archaeology confirms the existence of Canaanite culture. Numerous inscriptions and artifacts have been found from cities like Ugarit, Tyre, and Sidon, showing their language, religion, and societal structure. Their culture was advanced in art, trade, and military development. They were known for their fortified cities, chariots, and metallurgy, yet their religious practices stood in stark contrast to the holiness God demanded of his people. There were also individual Canaanites who responded to God with faith. The most well-known is Rahab, the prostitute from Jericho, who hid the Israelite spies and later became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. Hebrews 11:31 commends her faith, and Matthew 1:5 lists her among Jesus' ancestors. Another example is the Gibeonites, who deceived Joshua into making a covenant with them in Joshua 9. Though their method was deceptive, they showed reverence for the God of Israel and were spared. Over time, the term Canaanite began to refer more generally to the people who lived in the land of Canaan, regardless of their exact tribal identity. The term was sometimes used synonymously with Amorites, Hivites, and others. By the time of Jesus, the land of Canaan had long been dominated by various foreign empires, including the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Yet in Matthew 15:22, we read of a Canaanite woman who cried out to Jesus for help, showing that the cultural identity of the Canaanites still lingered centuries after the conquest. The story of the Canaanites in the Bible is a sobering reminder of the consequences of sin and rebellion against God. Their destruction was not about land or politics, but about judgment on a culture steeped in wickedness. At the same time, the stories of Rahab and the Gibeonites show that God's mercy is available to all who turn to him in faith. The failure of Israel to fully obey God's commands concerning the Canaanites became a source of spiritual downfall for generations. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromise and the importance of holiness among God's people. The influence of Canaanite religion would continue to plague Israel throughout the time of the Judges and into the monarchy. Kings like Solomon, despite their wisdom, allowed Canaanite worship practices to infiltrate Israel. 1 Kings 11:5 says, "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians." This led to idolatry and eventually the division of the kingdom. Later prophets like Elijah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah condemned the continuation of Canaanite worship practices among the Israelites. They stood boldly against Baal worship and called the people back to the true God. Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, found in 1 Kings 18, was a dramatic showdown between the God of Israel and the gods of Canaan. Fire from heaven consumed Elijah's offering, proving that Yahweh alone is God. The Canaanites, then, serve as both a historical and spiritual backdrop in the Bible. Their presence in the Promised Land created a test for Israel's faithfulness. Would Israel trust and obey God, or would they blend in with the nations around them? Unfortunately, time and time again, they chose the latter, leading to judgment, exile, and sorrow. In the end, the Canaanites were displaced, assimilated, or destroyed as history moved forward. But their legacy lives on in the scriptures as a warning and a lesson. Their story is a call to holiness, obedience, and faith in the one true God. If you enjoyed learning about the Bible, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment about what story you want to see next.